Reparations for the descendants of American slaves is an idea floated in various forms since passage of the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, outlawing slavery. Supporters of the idea have offered several arguments, but perhaps the easiest to visualize involves the analogy of a poker game played with a loaded deck, and what to do with the ill-gotten gains of the crooked card players once the truth is uncovered. Talk of reparations long existed only on the leftmost fringes of the political spectrum, but after decades of scattered discussion, the concept has now become a unifying principle in the crowded field of candidates seeking the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. Virtually all of those candidates support or accept the concept of reparations in some form. Many of the 22 candidates have openly supported reparations, and none have renounced it. The question among those looking to unseat President Trump is not whether reparations are appropriate, but in what form they should become policy. Bernie Sanders, who dismissed reparations as divisive in 2016, is now on board with it.
There are massive disparities that must be addressed. There is legislation that I like, introduced by Congressman Jim Clyburn. It's called the 10-20-30 legislation, which focuses federal resources in a very significant way on distressed communities, communities that have high levels of poverty. We have to do everything that we can to end institutional racism in this country.
Kamala Harris, whose prospects for the nomination have been lagging as Bernie's have risen, says she's for reparations because the playing field has not been level for people of color.
We've got to recognize people aren't starting out on the same base in terms of their ability to succeed. And so we have got to recognize that and give people a lift up. And there are a number of ways to do it. Part of my initiative, again, around the LIFT Act is that same point, lifting people up who are making less than $100,000 a year.
Now, the most vocal presidential candidate on the issue of reparations has been someone you probably forgot was even in the race, Julian Castro, who takes the argument back to an unjust founding of the nation itself.
This country should resolve its original sin of slavery, and that one of the ways we should consider doing that is through reparations for people who are the descendants of slaves. It is interesting to me that under our Constitution and otherwise, that we compensate people if we take their property. Shouldn't we compensate people if they were property?
So how would reparations be administered? Well, they'd likely involve payments to minority communities and individuals who can prove they're descendants of slaves. One can only imagine a mirror image of the so-called one-drop rule, which was historically employed to label and discriminate against anyone with even one drop of black blood, but which would now presumably be used for the opposite purpose, to qualify for reparation payments. Now, the question arising from this call to action is whether reparations are something we already implemented almost 50 years ago when affirmative action programs were written into law. Now, there's no hard numbers to quantify the results of opportunities granted to minorities and women through affirmative action, but we all know how it took hold in the 1970s and has been steadily cemented into the fabric of American life in the almost 50 years since. And we certainly know that this preferential treatment of minorities, though women are actually a majority, in an attempt to reverse historical discrimination, did result in millions of such opportunities, as was the intent of these programs. Now, whether affirmative action is justified preferential treatment or actually just a different form of discrimination than the one it seeks to reverse is a question we're still vigorously debating almost half a century later. We still haven't settled the issue of whether affirmative action constitutes payment in full for any debt which may be owed by society. Interestingly, the nation's first black president did not support reparations, believing it would be a convenient way to simply buy off those demanding social justice. Here's what Barack Obama stated, quote, "I fear reparations would be used as an excuse for some to say we've paid our debt and to avoid the much harder work of enforcing anti-discrimination laws in employment and housing, lifting people out of poverty, improving public education, and rehabilitating young men coming out of prison," unquote. Now, reparations are a modern concept and rare in history. Historically, the term reparations dealt primarily with the indemnification of states ravaged by war, such as those required of the Germans after World War I. But in the aftermath of World War II, the term began to acquire a broader meaning, extending beyond wartime to the domestic actions of a state. There's two primary historical instances of reparations. The most significant was Germany's payment to Holocaust survivors, or the equivalent of almost $9 billion in today's dollars. The U.S. also offered a far more modest $20,000 to each of the more than 80,000 Japanese Americans detained in internment camps during World War II. The seemingly sudden and widespread support among leading Democrats for reparations may turn out to be the culmination of a concept that has slowly crept into political conversation since 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson vowed to rectify the economic disadvantage blacks faced when he declared in a speech, which was considered a harbinger of affirmative action, quote, "Freedom is not enough. It is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity," unquote. Since that time, the trickle of interest in reparations beyond affirmative action has become a wave in the Democratic Party. And you can well expect to hear much discussion about it in the upcoming presidential debates, which begin in just over 1 month. We'll break away and then come back and analyze the congressional hearings with Attorney General William Barr.